Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. Now, at the end of the last lecture, I alluded to the great whimper that ended the great roaring of the 1920s, namely the stock market crash of 1929. During the 1920s, there was an unprecedented amount of prosperity in the American nation until that fateful Black Tuesday hit, and then we enter an era called the Great Depression. So, if you're ready to get depressed, I am. Let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Let me introduce you to the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. Hoover entered office March 4th, 1929, and in October of that same year, the stock market crashed and the nation's innards started to come apart. By 1930, 4 million people were out of work, and by the next year, 6 million, and nearly half of the banks of the country had failed. America had sunk into extreme poverty and duress. And so what was to be done? Well, Hoover was a Republican, and so he believed in minimal governmental intervention in, well, anything. And so when the Great Depression hit and scores of unemployed Americans began gathering themselves into bread lines, Hoover, like a good Republican, believed the market will correct for this. You see, Hoover thought that America overextended the market in the 20s with consumer credit and speculative stock purchases. And now the market is just swinging back to the other side of the pendulum, and eventually it will swing back to the middle and all shall be well. But there was a large contingent of folks who did not buy that the market will correct for everything theory. They were the people who had lost their homes and set up shanty towns, which they called Hoovervilles, and these were the people who slept at night under the cover of newspapers, which they called Hoover blankets. And I should hasten to mention that the characterization of Hoover as a heartless goon who is unwilling to help the masses out of their suffering is not really fair. He did care, and he did try to take some steps to alleviate the suffering of the masses, but those steps were too little, too late. And so by the time we get to the election of 1932, most Americans are sour about Hoover's non-interventionist policies. By this time, 11 million people were out of work. New home construction ground to a halt. Farms were foreclosed and people across the nation began eating what they could find out of trash heaps. And so the Americans decided to elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who criticized Hoover on the campaign trail, saying the following: "This country needs and demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another, but above all, try something." And in the spirit of experimentation, FDR tried a crapload of experiments on America to help her climb out of the pit of poverty. In what he called the 100 Days, Roosevelt worked with Congress to pass a dizzying amount of legislation, which he called the New Deal. And the New Deal focused on what Roosevelt called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And here are just a few of the more important agencies created by the 100 Days Congress. There was the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put Americans to work in things like reforestation, firefighting, and swamp drainage. There was also the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration, which put Americans to work on internal improvements like bridge building and road surfacing. There was the NRA, not that NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which established minimum wage for workers. There was the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which paid farmers not to farm portions of their land since they were glutting the market with too many foodstuffs for sale. And it should not surprise you that many conservatives of the time hotly criticized this growing intervention of the government, which included the growth of the federal government itself. On the other hand, even though the Republicans were correct about the increasing size and intervention of the federal government, at the bare minimum, at least Democrats were putting people to work and not simply giving them a handout. And meanwhile, in the Midwest, disaster was striking. After a prolonged drought in 1933 and years of overcultivation of the already dry soil, Midwestern states began experiencing the awful terror of unprecedented dust storms. Huge clouds of dust, towering as high as mountains, rolled in on the wind and covered everything in dirt. And then it happened again and again. Soon, Midwesterners, especially Oklahomans and Arkansans, left their homes in what was becoming known as the Dust Bowl and migrated in huge numbers to California, where they hoped to find work, though few of them ever did. And it was at this time that the 100 Days Congress passed what was perhaps the most significant of all New Deal legislations, the Social Security Act. This act put an additional tax on workers' incomes. So, when a worker retired, that worker would receive monthly payments from the federal government. And the idea was to create a safety net against any sort of future grinding poverty that might happen in another depression. And Roosevelt argued that this kind of thing was exactly what our nation needed. I mean, when we were a nation of farmers way back in the day, every member of the family had chores to do and work appropriate to them. And as one generation aged, the younger generation would care for that older generation. But in the age of industrialization and urbanization, when extended families were coming apart, the federal government, Roosevelt argued, was now responsible for the upkeep and care of its people. Now, whatever you think about the New Deal programs today, apparently the Americans of that time approved because they re-elected Roosevelt in 1936 by a massive landslide. And, of course, Roosevelt saw his re-election as a mandate from the people to continue to expand New Deal legislation. And maybe one of the most significant consequences of the New Deal was a massive spike in government spending. You see, during his first term, Roosevelt clung to the idea of keeping a relatively balanced federal budget. But under the influence of an economist named John Maynard Keynes, Roosevelt further embraced deficit spending as a way to prime the national pump of economic prosperity. In 1932, America's national debt was about $19 billion. Just 7 years later, the national debt had ballooned to over $40 billion. It was a hole that grew deeper by the year as America continued to languish in its depressed state. But there's always one thing that can help any nation get out of its debt hole, and that's a war. And so I guess we'll never know whether or not FDR's New Deal would have gotten America out of the Depression or not, because here we come to World War II, and that's the thing that's eventually going to pull us out of this economic despair. But we'll get to that in another lecture. I'll see you next time.